Right.
Next.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, or good whatever it is where you are. My name is Guy Franklin. I'm co-hosting with John today. So Imanni Sheppard is here with us to talk a little about the life and work balance. So with that, Imanni, please go ahead. Oh, my apologies, before we get started, please make sure you mute yourselves until the very end to the Q&A. There's a lot of background noise and Zoom's being a little iffy today, so I want to make sure that we all hear Imanni loud and clear. And please limit the chat conversations, as people who will be viewing this later may get a little confused. I know I did when I went online and viewed our lovely BEC Learning Hub site, and so I could not track the video with the chat. So please keep it to a minimum, though we love the comments. So with that, Imanni, please go ahead.
Okay, and again, thank you guys for, I guess, virtually coming. I don't know what the appropriate language is for that. I am out of Barterley College in New Orleans, or Beckno. I'm an assistant professor of medical humanities over there in clinical bioethics. So what we're going to look at today is not just the work-life balance in terms of giving you the basic toolbox that can help with that, but what are some of the physiological and psychological aspects that are really significant to helping your immune system in this time of quarantine, and also how those things situate within issues of the self in the times of quarantine. So I'm going to start from the beginning, and then we'll move through those issues of stress and physiological, psychological issues, how they affect the immune system, and then what that toolbox looks like. So first off, for the most part, prior to things like quarantine, we all exist within the scope of what are referred to as the multiplicity of identities. We have these, they exist simultaneously. So like right now, I am mother, daughter, sister, aunt, professor, sometimes dancer, photographer, etc. And generally speaking, what we do is we oscillate between all of these things depending on a particular situation. So if a part of your personality, part of your identity is dancer, when you are, on stage, you are dancer, you're probably not chef, right? So all of this is basic, the basic foundations of who we are. These things are supported by time and space of a particular event. This is how we pick and choose which aspects of our identity make the most sense given a particular time and given a particular space. However, in times where our movement is limited and controlled, our identities collapse upon themselves, which is one of the things that instigates a lot of stress for many of us. It's because when you're home now, right, we're all quarantined, we're all home, or you should be home, you don't have the opportunity to leave and decide, okay, at this particular time and space, I'm going to be professor, and then I come home, and then I'm mother, and then I'll go to a studio, and then I'm photographer. Instead, you're all of those things at the same space at the same time, because it collapses upon itself in the time of quarantine. So this is essentially what that looks like. If we were to diagram the multiplicity of our identities. So on my left, you'll see sort of this spectrum, right? Where I can, again, tick between the different aspects of my identity given time and space. Whereas on the other side, I don't have the opportunity to compartmentalize. Once you lose the ability to compartmentalize and oscillate between the varying aspects of your identity, you increase your stress, which also dampens your immune system. So another thing that happens when the multiplicity of your identities collapses upon itself is called narrative rupture. And this is when the sense of self shifts or ruptures in response to a phenomenon. For many of us, this phenomenon is the quarantine, right? So one way that you can think of that is if you are a dancer and you break your leg and you're not able to dance anymore, then the way that you perceived yourself has shifted. And so the narrative that you have for yourself also shifts. That's a narrative rupture. Generally, the way that we respond to a narrative rupture is in one or two ways. Either it can develop into a process of reflexivity, adaptive learning. You can try to make sense of the situation and reconstruct a positive identity. So if you've ever seen one of those movies where the girl is swimming in the ocean, she gets attacked by a shark, shark rips off her arm, she continues to be a surfer, that's what happens. She has a narrative rupture, she's a surfer, the shark rips her arm off, and out of that, she becomes more reflexive, and then she's still able to build a positive identity out of that. In some situations, however, it can cause you to lose your sense of self. Again, the multiplicity of identity, all the little things that you may not necessarily pay attention to in terms of who you are as an individual will shift dramatically. And once those things shift because of your inability to compartmentalize or oscillate between the multiplicity of identities, you increase your potentiality for stress-related illnesses. And so when we're talking about work-life balance, what we're looking at is the intersection of the collapsing of the multiplicity of identities with the increased potentiality of a stress-related illness, and recognizing the ways in which stress can negatively impact our lives, and again, creating a toolbox to address some of those things. So I do want to spend a little bit of time parsing out what that looks like when we, oftentimes people always talk about, oh, stress is horrible, stress is all of these horrible things, but we never really think about what is happening in the body and nuance how we can begin to address some of those things. So again, as you lose your ability to compartmentalize your stress, your environment becomes your stressor. So for those of us that are in quarantine, or rather what you can think of it as like if a dog is chasing you, the dog is your stressor. The longer we stay confined in our homes under quarantine, the higher the probability that our environment will become a stressor. You're around the same people all the time. You don't necessarily have the opportunity to leave and go to the grocery store. You go to the grocery store, you're putting on masks and gloves, etc. So whereas in the past, a stressor may have been a direct engagement with a disease or illness, which is what we're trying to avoid. In this case, your environment becomes your stressor. Every time you are unable to compartmentalize, you engage with the stressor, and then your body cycles through what is called the general adaptation syndrome, or the GAS. And this is what happens. So first, your body goes through an alarm reaction. That's, if you can imagine how it feels when you're startled, right? You take a deep breath, your heart starts beating really fast, you might start sweating, you go through the alarm reaction. After you go through the alarm reaction in the body, your heart starts beating fast and you get an adrenaline push, all of these things are happening, then your body starts to try to cope with whatever that stress was. So you enter what is called the resistance stage. Now, when you get an increase in what is called cortisol, you're entering the resistance stage. You need the cortisol. It starts to break down sugars and fats in your body, but you're also still hyper aware of the previous stressor. So while your heartbeat has dropped a little bit, your blood pressure increases and your cortisol increases. So you're not sweating and all of that, but you still have some of what is referred to as that fight or flight. The longer you stay in the resistance mode, which is the longer you try to deal with your stressor, which in this case is confinement, right? In quarantine, the longer we're quarantined, the longer the body stays in the resistance stage. The longer you're in the resistance stage, the higher the probability that your body will become exhausted. And that's not just, well, I'm really tired or I'm starting to feel overwhelmed. It's feeling overwhelmed, feelings of depression, feelings of anxiety, and all of the stresses that come from that. And as you increase your stress, you dampen your immune system. So this is one way to look at it, right? So you have your general adaptation syndrome. Your body first goes through the alarm stage. Our stressors are already identified for us because we're in quarantine. The body produces adrenaline. You go through fight or flight. Your heartbeat starts to increase. and your body stays there until you start to cope with the stress. Okay, we're quarantined. I still have to get work done. I still have to be a mother. I still want to fill out grant applications. You're starting to cope with the stress. But while that's happening, your body is still producing cortisol. It's just reducing the amount of adrenaline and trying to bring your heartbeat back to normal. As your body starts to deal with the strains and demands, again, the longer this happens, it's not something that is sustainable by the body. And that's where the need for instituting a very healthy work-life balance comes into play. Because again, the longer your body tries to stay in resistance with limited resources, the resources of your body will start to be depleted and your immune system will start to drop. Once that happens, again, you enter the exhaustion stage, and it becomes very difficult to maintain the normal functions of your body. This is where you start to lose concentration, you're sleeping more, you're not feeling well, you have migraines, you get ulcers, you have high blood pressure, all of these things. So this is problematized even more by individuals who are minority. Individuals who are consistently subjected to oppression via inequity, structural violence, and/or racism are in a persisting state of fight or flight. That means that those individuals are always bouncing back and forth between the alarm reaction and resistance phase. So this occurs before, for example, quarantine. That means that you're already between alarm and resistance, and then quarantine acts as an additional stressor, which then also acts to dampen the immune system. This also means that individuals who are minority, you have an elevated cortisol because you're in the resistance and alarm stages longer. So the body is always responding to a stressor, which in this case is society. So this is one of the reasons why many minority groups are overrepresented with things like high blood pressure. It's because the cortisol levels are constantly high, and while the heartbeat is normal, you have all of these other hormones that are being released into the body all the time. So individuals that are in minority groups or any kind of oppressed group, when you enter quarantine, you're entering quarantine already with high cortisols, which means you're already dealing with a sensitive immune system. And so then when you deal with your environment, right, this notion that the reality of being quarantined, you're starting from a deficit. You are starting from the deficit of an immunological deficit. This means that you have to work that much harder to have a work-life balance so that you're not further dampening your immune system, which increases the probability for other kinds of illnesses, secondary illnesses, even if you're not actually affected by COVID-19. So what ends up happening is each time you encounter a stressor, so again, if you're a minority person or you have been subjected to any kinds of oppression, racism, structural violence, you're starting from essentially 2 notches down on your immune system already. Each time you go through an additional stressor, such as being quarantined, your body will cycle through what is referred to as the general adaptation syndrome. So again, and you will end up with what is called cross-sensitization. The more you go through a stressor, the more your body becomes cross-sensitized. That means one way that you can think of it is if you have, I guess the simplest way is, if you have 10 immune system cells and you go through a stressor at work, one has to leave and handle that. And then you are chased by a dog and 2 have to leave and handle that. And each time you go through a stressor, that's fewer cells that can actually help your immune system that can keep you well. So this essentially means that there is not enough healthy immunity to fight off each stressor. So the point of that is, again, you're starting with a certain immunological, or you could be starting with a certain immunological deficit at the start of quarantine. And then being in quarantine is inherently stressful. So then you have another stressor. And if you don't maintain a healthy work-life balance, each time you deal with some aspect of that work-life balance that is not stable or does not have a solid foundation, each stressor will further dampen your immune system and increase the potentiality of you getting a different kind of sickness, even if you don't necessarily engage with COVID-19. So it's important to maintain the self. It becomes extraordinarily important for you to help your immune system help you, right? And this is, again, done by having a healthy work-life balance, which is a struggle whether you are quarantined or not, right? So there are several approaches to this: the physical, the physiological, and the psychological. So the physical, you can only imagine the simplest thing, the most obvious thing is wash your hands, right? If we're trying not to get something that is spread by touch or droplet sequences, et cetera, covering your face, washing your hands, we all know that, right? To try and stave off COVID-19. What we tend to forget, however, is the significance of exercise. I know it sounds cliche. People are like, wash your hands and exercise and clean your body and things like that. But say, for example, taking care of your body, brushing your teeth, all of those things is not just about cleanliness. Those are about maintaining routine. And maintaining that routine provides psychological stability. It gives your body and your life normalcy, which helps your immune system because it helps you to stay balanced. When you exercise, exercising is also important, not just to stay physically fit, but because when you work out, your body releases endorphins that make you feel more positive. It releases serotonin, which increases feelings of serenity and hopefulness and reduces stress, and antibodies, thereby helping your immune system help you. You also encounter what's called the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which will help to protect the brain from emotional disorders such as depression, and it repairs the body from stress. So again, I'm talking about these things that are peripheral to what's happening on the outside world, right? We know that we can protect ourselves by staying home, by covering our faces, by washing our hands. But the thing that we become very susceptible to in times of quarantine is stress, depression, and stress-related illnesses and diseases, sicknesses. So this work-life balance becomes really significant to maintaining our health while we're in quarantine. And any little bit of exercise will do this. You don't have to go out and do the P90X or something that's going to make you cry and question your life choices. You really can just do something really simple and it will still release the same amount of hormones in your body. The psychological, again, we tend to disregard how important it is for you to do something specifically for yourself every day. I can't say that enough. Do something that is specifically for you every day. Those of us that have children, that have spouses, all of that, we find it very difficult to find time for ourselves or spend money for ourselves, etc. But you need that because you need to train your brain reward system. So the brain reward system is essentially a group of neural structures that are responsible for incentive, salience, learning, positive emotions, that help you to stay psychologically balanced during the time of quarantine. And doing something simple for yourself could be, I'm going to work for a couple of hours and then I'm going to sit down and eat this chocolate, or I'm going to, work out for myself, or I'm going to watch this movie, whatever it is that makes you feel good, right? We say those things. Oh, well, I went and got my nails done. It made me feel good. I went and got my car washed. It made me feel good. We say those things sort of with a grain of salt, but that's exactly what it's doing. It does make you feel good. It actually helps your immune system. So in terms of a work-life balance, you have to figure out some moment in the day to be able to do something for yourself every day. What I strongly recommend, especially if you have other people who are in your household with you, is either wake up before them or go to sleep after them. And the reason I say that is because you need those moments of quiet. What we tend to take for granted are those moments, say, when you're in your car or you're on the subway and you're going to a particular location and you're in that place by yourself, or maybe not the subway, but if you're in your car and you're going to work, that 20 minutes or 30 minutes, it's just you time. And you listen to whatever songs you want to, you end up reflecting. You don't realize how much of that time actually helps with your psychological self. So if you wake up before the rest of the people in your household, or after, or you go to sleep after the people in your household, that gives you a moment of silence to yourself that will give you the opportunity to reward yourself and institute that kind of brain reward system. And that can, again, just be 15 minutes. That can be 10 minutes. You don't have to wake up, as my friend says, with God every morning at 4 o'clock in the morning to go do Pilates. No, you just need a few minutes to reward yourself so that you're able to start the process of compartmentalizing aspects of your identity. So that 15 minutes before everybody wakes up, you can be, well, I can be Imanni. Or when my son goes to sleep, I can be Imanni and I can watch 30 minutes of a wushu film. And that's something that I've done to reward myself. In terms of the physiological, I cheated because all of them are physiological, right? All of these things circle back to what you can do to maintain your immune system. But again, in order to have a work-life balance that also helps your immune system help you, you should find a spot in your house and designate that spot your work spot. Go to that location every day. That's the only place you work from. That starts to train your body and train your mind so that when you are in this location, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. It sounds like something very simple because it is, but training your mind happens very quickly. Training your body takes 28 days. Training your mind takes as little as 5. And the way that you can think of training your mind is if you've ever, say, been driving home and you're thinking about other things and people say, oh, you're on autopilot, if you've ever heard that before. Well, you're on autopilot just means that you've trained your mind. Your brain has created a series of neurological pathways that tell you what to do. If you have a designated spot in your house and that's where you work from, when you're sitting in that spot, your brain will recognize I'm supposed to be working. And it's a way to help focus. So design timeframes as opposed to specific time schedules. I know many people, especially if you have a type A personality, this will be a little bit more difficult because you're like, I'm gonna work from 1 to 2 o'clock. But the reality of it is, when you're able to compartmentalize the multiplicity of your identities, you can absolutely work from 1 to 2 o'clock. When, however, your identities are collapsed upon themselves, you don't necessarily have that leeway. What happens instead is you should probably work in terms of time frames. I'm going to work for 2 hours, as opposed to from 2 to 4. Because if, say, for example, you have other people in your household and you say you're only going to work from 2 to 4, if your child suddenly wants something or something in the house breaks or you decide you want to wash clothes or you're not able to focus, those 2 hours, if you're not able to work within that 2 hour, the 2 to 4 time frame, will institute feelings of guilt, which also increases your stress, which also dampens your immune system. So try to work from time frames as opposed to specific time schedules like 2 to 4. Create a specific time in the day when you and or your family will have meaningful time together. This might sound a little odd given the fact that we're all in quarantine. And if, again, you have people in your family and y'all are all under quarantine, you're like, I see them all day, every day for the next 15 months. Like, I don't need meaningful time, but you totally need meaningful time. And the reason for that is because there's a very big difference between being in a space with someone and spending meaningful time with them, right? I can sit at the table, my son can sit on the sofa, and we can be in the same space and not actually be together. And so one of the things that I've seen happen, especially with things like hurricanes, and if you read like histories of quarantines, et cetera, is that people start to be sort of shadows passing in the night. You are all in the same space, but you're not actually engaging. And so what you end up having to do is, by creating meaningful time every day, you're training your bodies and your mind. So it's okay to do the ships passing in the night thing, but you know every time for dinner we're going to be here. And so you've trained your body and your mind so that at some point later in the afternoon, we're going to have meaningful time. That also makes it a lot easier once quarantine is over to begin that process of compartmentalizing again, because you'll still be able to go about your daily lives and then return for that meaningful time that you've already experienced. The last thing is human and human encounter. Rather, it doesn't matter if it's virtually or on the phone, but not texting. This is important because a part of the human psyche, as well as the maintenance of our psychological and physiological selves, is actually human-human contact. This is one of the reasons why preemies, little tiny babies who aren't doing very well, if you sit next to them, they'll start to do better. If you touch their hands, they'll start to do better. If you sing to them, they get better and better and better. That is the foundation of humanity, of how we are as humans. So while it's great to text someone, that actually doesn't feed your body and your mind in the same way as making a phone call or Skyping someone or having some actual human-to-human contact. So what you have to do in terms of maintaining a work-life balance is, again, think in terms of time frames so that you are not building guilt and frustration into your day by saying that, oh, I wasn't able to work from 2 to 4. You're thinking in terms of efficacy, not time frame. I'm going to have just these few things that I'm going to take care of, and I'm going to do them for 2 hours. And as long as you do that, then you reward yourself with that one thing that you can reward yourself with every day. Speak with someone so that you can hear someone's voice and spend time. Make sure that you have a designated spot that you work from every day. If you have children in particular, do the same for them, because you also want to train their bodies and their minds. And that way they can be working while you're working, so that it's not like you're trying to work and they're running around and you're like, this designated spot thing doesn't work. It's sticking me off, right? So you spend less time trying to get your household on this very hyper-regimented schedule that mimics your previous pre-quarantine life, because that's unrealistic. What you need to do is you're going to have to structure your quarantine so that it allows for spaces to work in given time frames, for you to reward yourself and for you to maintain that sense of humanity through engagement and meaningful time together. So that's it. Any questions?
So for the question and answer portion, please use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen or type in the chat.
Okay, let's see.
John, go ahead.
I think you're still on mute, John. Let's see.
Oh, I'll put him on.
Okay, there we go. Thank you for this really thought-provoking presentation. An idea that I'm interested in hearing more about is when you said that it takes, I want to say it was 4 to 5 days to train your mind, but 28 days to train your body. Can you say more about that?
Okay, well, essentially what happens with the body is when you're talking about training the body, you're talking about training your what are called circadian rhythms. This is if you're one of those people, say for example, who use an alarm, at some point in your life, usually after 28 days, you don't need the alarm anymore. Your body will wake up at that time on its own. So what's happened is your circadian rhythms have shifted because you've created a routine. Your mind doesn't necessarily need that routine. It doesn't need it for that long. Because once you start a process, you start to get neurological grooves in the brain to create memory of that. So say, for example, the first time you drive somewhere, you look at a map so that you can remember the streets. The next time you're going that way, you won't necessarily have to look at that map. You'll still remember some of those streets. So the process just happens much more instantaneous because it's tied to memory as opposed to the physical functions of the body.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
My circadian rhythms have gotten way off during this situation.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
and they've never been good because they don't align that well to the general workday. But now I'm starting to revert into what I think of as dissertation hours.
Yeah.
Not a period of my circadian rhythms I'm eager to revisit, but that's kind of, it's like, it's really drifting.
Yeah, and a part of that too is again, those identities collapsing on themselves. So what happens is when you're in the multiplicity of those identities, you know, okay, I have to be to work at 8:30, or I have to be to work at 9 o'clock. And so your heart and your mind, not your heart, well, your body and your mind are working together to get you up because you have to be at a particular space that's tied to a particular identity. But when you're in quarantine, you don't need that. There is nothing that's telling you I have to be at a particular place that's tied to memory and that's tied to body. So instead of still waking up at 7 o'clock in the morning, you might wake up at 10. And that's also the reason why it's more beneficial to work in terms of time frames instead of a time schedule, because your body is going to be out of whack and it is going to be a lot more difficult for you to train your body and get it on some kind of circadian rhythm because you don't have that angst of being one piece of that identity at a particular place.
Thank you.
I have a question. What do you do if you're already at, like, I guess, close to like breaking already? Like your stress level's already up there. Like what's the best way to bring it back to like workable, livable?
Yeah, all of that stuff. Absolutely. So what it would mean is it would mean that you've been in the resistance stage for a long time and that you're at the brink of exhaustion. So a couple of things have to happen. The first question I would have is, what makes you happy? Like, what did you used to do pre-quarantine that was the thing that made you giggle or that made you feel most like yourself? And I'm not saying you have to answer it here because, you know, but.
Yeah, and unfortunately that thing I can't do right now because of quarantine.
Can you do an aspect of it?
No.
Well, then my answer would be find a creative outlet. Take a few moments to step back from those things that are causing you extreme stress, right? Take a moment, step back from them, and find a creative outlet. Because normally what people would suggest is get a journal and start journaling it out. But what ends up happening sometimes is during the brain dump, you make yourself more stressed and more sad because you're reviewing what you're writing and what is the thing that's causing you stress, right? So you're writing about the stress that's causing you stress, that you're writing about the stress, and it causes you stress, and you go into this weird little cycle. So you're gonna have to step back for a second. You're gonna have to step back and then do something absolutely random that you think is ridiculous.
Okay.
Because you're gonna need to shock yourself out of it. So if that means painting or going on DIY.com and, you know, refurbishing your chair that you always said you were gonna do, but you didn't do, or creating some kind of old shirt tote bags, like it's gonna have to be something in other words, it's going to have to be something completely left field for you so that you can engage in it and so that it's new. It has to be something that's novel. It's going to have to be something that's new because you need that excitement that comes with newness, because that excitement is going to increase your dopamine and serotonin and reward you. And those little rewards that you get is going to change your mood because it's a chemical thing. So it has to be something novel. And when I tell you something left field that you read about that you think is just absolutely random, do that thing. Because you need that, you're going to have to, you need that reward. You need that dopamine and that serotonin to kick you out of exhaustion.
Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome.
You have a question from Christian. Go ahead, Christian.
Okay.
Hi, thanks. I really like the stuff about the body. And I was just wondering how that applies also to diet and food and eating schedules. Because during the school year, I'm at the school building. And so it's kind of very situated when I'm going to eat. But now that I'm at home full time, I tend to just eat when I get hungry. Is that okay? Or should I be trying to force like eating at the same time every day?
I wouldn't necessarily force the eating at the same time every day, but I would try to be more conscious of having actual meals. Because what can happen when we're in situations like this is grazing. And so you kind of walk around, you eat a little bit, then you sit down and eat a little bit more. And so you're constantly just munching on something, which decreases the probability that whatever it is that you're munching on is actually healthy. So what I would suggest is, again, you want to try and stay away from doing things at a very hyper-specific time frame and just think of it as, you know, I'm going to work for a couple of hours here. And then when I'm done, I'm going to make a really good meal and sit down and eat that meal. So try to get yourself towards eating actual meals throughout the course of the day, as opposed to grazing throughout the course of the day, which can also lead to depression if you start gaining weight and then you're just like, this sucks. I'm not healthy. I'm grazing, right? It's a whole thing. So again, of course, you want to try and be conscious of what you're eating, but also, again, try eating actual meals as opposed to eating little bits here and there. Does that help?
You bet. Thanks.
Okay.
You have a question from Eden Renee says, this was great. Thank you. Bye, Eden Renee.
Thank you, Renee. It's been real.
It has been real. It truly is real, which is, I appreciate. I have a question.
Okay.
What about the guilt? When when you're in that cycle of, it takes 3 minutes to change your brain, but then you realize, oh, I need to change my brain. Do you have any advice about that guilt factor that I hope I'm not the only one who feels that?
No, everybody has that guilt factor. And that's, again, one of the reasons why thinking in terms of I'm going to work from 2 to 4 is not a good idea. Because you will start to be like, oh my God, like I was supposed to work from 2 to 4 and I didn't. I washed my clothes and my life is, you know what I mean? You'll go into that guilt factor and then it becomes very counterproductive. So what I would do is think just in terms of what you can do over the week. So if you're like, oh, I have to change my brain, 3 minutes, I could have done that in 3 minutes and changed my brain. And it's like, no, I didn't get to it now. Give yourself a little bit of leeway and then say, remember, it's about productivity. So I didn't do it this time, but I'm going to work on being more productive throughout the course of the day. I'm going to sit down and eat. I'm going to do something novel. Then I'm going to reward myself because I was productive, and I'm going to continue to work. And so that's the thing that we all have to work on, is making the conscious effort to work, then stop. Like, it's over now. I've worked for my 4 hours. I've worked for my 8 hours. I'm going to stop. I'm going to reward myself. I'm going to eat. Because what will end up happening, and what I know has happened to some of my peers and myself already, is you wake up, and because you don't have any time gaps, and because you're home and your identities have collapsed, you'll just work and work and work and work and work until it's time to go to sleep. And then you go to sleep, and then you wake up, and then you work and work and work and work and work. So the thing is not thinking about, well, I can change my mind in these 3 minutes, but thinking of it in terms of, I'm going to work for these X amount of hours that you're designating to yourself, because the end game is productivity, not time. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Jean has a question. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah. Why is everything taking so much more time?
It's taking more time. Again, I know it, and it sounds really silly, but once you start collapsing those identities, everything takes more time. So when you go to work, you're like, I'm here for a particular purpose, and the purpose is work. So you can designate all your time and energy and your focus on that thing. And so it doesn't take as much time. But when you're home, your phone rings, you remember you need to eat, you're tired, you go use the bathroom 4 or 5 times, right? So there's all of these other little things that didn't used to be a part of your work schedule that is now, because those identities have collapsed on top of each other. And again, and I know I probably sound like a broken record, but that's also why saying you're going to work from one time to another time is counterproductive. You have to be thinking of, I'm going to work for these 3 hours, and this is what I want to accomplish at the end. Because it will take more time, and it's taking more time because you have more distractions, because now you are professor, mother, wife, sister, all at the same time, and you're watching the news to find out, when am I not going to have to do this anymore, right? So that's a few of the reasons why things take longer, is because they haven't been compartmentalized into a specific workspace. Now the workspace is the home space, is the life space, is the art space, is the food space, is the, right? All of these things. Yeah. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
You have a question from Tiffany. Go ahead, Tiffany.
So you're mentioning like the idea of compartmentalizing and how, well, I guess previous it was, now it's all collapsed. Is there like at some point where we can start to separate again? I know you mentioned the idea of place, but does it ever, I guess, could we ever get to a point where we can start compartmentalizing again? Or is it just kind of, we have to deal with the collapse?
The problem is when you are hyperstationary, you kind of have to deal with the collapse. Because a part of the reason we are able to compartmentalize successfully is because of the shift in time and place. So when the shift in place is removed, then what ends up happening is, again, the place is too stationary. You don't need to shift between identities. One way that you can try to push back on that is, again, if you have one particular location where this is your work spot, that helps. Or, you know, your backyard is where you practice Taekwondo, right? So that you maintain that piece of your identity. I'm a Taekwondo. I don't know if it's a Taekwondo person. I don't know what, anyway. But being very specific about where you conduct certain aspects of your job or yourself will help with that. But they won't really, the collapse won't really fold out until you're able to consistently change location. So while we're quarantined, you're very likely going to be dealing with that collapse because you have to stay in one spot. But again, designating individual spaces to do very particular things will help with that. But then you also have to be consistent. So if you designate this space, this is your workspace, on Wednesday, you don't get to say, it's kind of making my tuchus hurt, I'm going to sit on the sofa and work. Because then what ends up happening is you sort of shift what you've trained your mind and your body to do. And what will happen is your mind and body won't register sitting on the sofa with productivity. And then you want to turn on the TV, and then you're like, I'm going to multitask and watch the last thing of Game of Thrones again because it was awful and I want to analyze it, right? And now you're watching Game of Thrones and you're trying to work, and it's not going to be a smooth enough transition. And then you end up bouncing back and forth and you cycle back to guilt, and then it's another issue, right? It's another issue. So you want to try to make sure, again, you have designated areas to do designated things, and that will help a lot with that collapse. It'll help a lot more than trying to figure out how to not be in the collapse. Like, we're here, right? So yeah, that'll be the best way to do it, I think. Once everything changes, though, you'll be back to compartmentalizing. Any other questions? It's so weird to like look at the boxes of faces and then not hear anything. It's very different than if you're like, you know, if you're giving a conference or a lecture speak and people are right there. Yeah, it's, you know, I don't know if I'm supposed to be trying to make, go ahead.
John W. has a question.
Okay.
So someday, which will hopefully be soon, but who knows, when we're back to being in our previous range of physical spaces, to what extent will the compartmentalization naturally reoccur? And to what extent will we have kind of a reverse culture shock effect?
So with regards to the reverse culture shock, I think it depends on the culture. And the reason I say that is because, say, for example, here in New Orleans, you know, we all speak to each other. We're all in each other's faces and spend too much time talking to each other and shaking hands and kissing cheeks and all of these things, right? But now, because we can't do that, it's shifted how we engage and what has become the new normative. So I think that once we come out of quarantine, people will still be somewhat apprehensive because we would have already trained our bodies to keep that social distance. So I think it depends on the culture. In terms of what will naturally occur with the individual, I think you will almost snap right back into it because you're snapping back out of need. So if you are, you know, once quarantine is over and you're like, okay, I have a child, I have to bring my child to school now, I have to go get groceries, I have to go to work, that will allow you to compartmentalize almost instantaneously. Yeah. So your body, your brain will start to naturally progress back towards the compartmentalized self. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. And again, place plays a big role in that. Once you're able to move around and you're at the daycare center, you're able to take on the role of mother because that's what it requires. So a big part of that is being able to move in different spaces at different times. It's not something that we are generally cognizant of.
Well, thank you, Imanni, and thank you to all for being here. And that was incredibly helpful. Thank you.
Awesome.
With that, I'd like to talk about what is expected of tomorrow. John W., would you mind sharing that with us?
Sure. So tomorrow we are going to be sharing, talking about, hopefully celebrating the experience of figuring out how to teach with kids around us. I actually don't have any of my own, so I will not be speaking, but three people who do know a lot about this, Vanessa Anderson, Bill Heinrichs, and Julia Carey Arundel from 3 different cities will be talking about their experiences and leading a roundtable discussion about this phenomenon. So as I say, either bring yourself with or without your kids, though I know sometimes the with or without your kids isn't actually a choice in this situation. The kids may just decide to appear, but again, no, whatever is most comfortable for you. I do want to talk about a previous attraction in yesterday's session, which was led by BSEC Manhattan alum Savannah Angeline D'Amato. It was a mindfulness workshop focusing on sound, which was a very transformative experience. So if you're looking for that thing to do that isn't something you normally do, you might go onto the BEC Learning Hub and pull down that. It's just that we just did a sound recording of that one because it is sound focused. It was only about 15 minutes. We did talk a little bit afterwards, but you don't need a lot of time. So where Dr. Sheppard is telling us that we need to do something, if you can't think of what your thing to do is, maybe try this one out. I will say that for me, the first, and literally 15 seconds of activity that Savannah led us through was already physically transformative for me. So if you only have 15 seconds, I hope you have more, but if you only have 15 seconds, that's the 15 seconds I would recommend. So that's what we've got kind of from Friday and from Wednesday. Yeah, Jean, I see you have a question.
Yes, can you tell us again what that was? What did
Yep.
you call it?
It was a mindfulness.
Where do I find it? I mean, what is it?
We can post the URL in the chat, and you can go in there and click onto it. It was a mindfulness workshop focused on sound. So you just need to click onto it and listen and follow what it says.
And you'll also be able to find Imanni's presentation also on the BC Learning Hub if you would love a reminder of any of these lovely tips or hints, and a reminder just to be present and accounted for. So with that, thank you all sincerely, and I'm gonna
Thanks, guys.
click the recording button to stop.